The marble walls of Atlanta Municipal Court absorbed the afternoon heat, creating a stifling atmosphere that matched the tension in Courtroom 4B. Judge Richard Maxwell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with practiced precision, his weathered fingers brushing against his silver hair. At 68, he had spent over 2 decades on the bench, earning a reputation that made defendants' lawyers squirm when they saw his name on their docket. Today's afternoon session had already dragged through 6 cases, each receiving the judge's trademark stern treatment. But it was the 7th case that would shake the foundations of his carefully constructed world. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and firm. The state versus Dr. Sarah Washington. Criminal trespassing, first degree. Dr. Washington rose from her seat with quiet dignity. Her charcoal gray suit and pearl necklace spoke of sophistication, while her composed demeanor suggested someone unused to standing before a judge. At 43, her face carried the subtle signs of someone who worked long hours, but took pride in their profession. She stood straight-backed, hands clasped in front of her, dark eyes focused ahead. Judge Maxwell glanced down at the case file, his lips pursing slightly as he read the details. According to the report, Dr. Washington had been caught entering Grady Memorial Hospital through an emergency exit at 2:47 a.m., triggering multiple security alarms. When confronted by security, she had refused to leave, insisting she needed to reach the surgical wing immediately. Ms. Washington, Judge Maxwell began, deliberately omitting her title, "You stand accused of criminal trespassing at Grady Memorial Hospital. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," her attorney interjected, "I'd like to note for the record that my client is Dr. Washington. And she." "The court will refer to the defendant as it sees fit," Judge Maxwell interrupted, his tone carrying years of unchallenged authority. A few veteran lawyers in the gallery exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this before. The subtle ways Maxwell wielded his power, particularly with minority defendants. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Washington responded, her voice clear and steady. "Not guilty, Your Honor. If I could explain the circumstances." "The circumstances," Judge Maxwell cut in, appear quite clear from the security report. "You broke into a hospital in the middle of the night, refused to comply with security personnel, and continued to trespass despite multiple warnings." He peered down at her over his glasses, his expression a practiced mix of disapproval and wariness. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom's wooden benches. The gallery had filled up during the day's proceedings, law students, waiting defendants, and curious onlookers drawn by the peculiar case of a well-dressed woman charged with breaking into a hospital. Dr. Washington's attorney, Mark Bennett, stood again. "Your Honor, if you'll allow us to present evidence of my client's position at the hospital and the emergency situation that—" "Mr. Bennett," Judge Maxwell's voice carried a warning edge. "Your client was caught on security cameras forcing entry into a medical facility after hours. Unless you're suggesting the footage has been falsified, I don't see what possible justification." The heavy courtroom doors suddenly burst open, cutting off Judge Maxwell's words and drawing all eyes to the back of the room. A man in surgical scrubs stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, clutching a manila envelope in his hands. The next few moments would shatter Judge Maxwell's worldview, though he didn't know it yet. But for now, he simply sat in annoyed silence, watching his carefully controlled courtroom descend into unexpected chaos. The man in surgical scrubs hadn't made it 3 steps into the courtroom before Judge Maxwell's gavel cracked against the sound block. "Bailiff," his voice boomed across the room, "remove that individual immediately." The interruption had disrupted his carefully orchestrated atmosphere of control, and Maxwell wasn't about to let it continue. But before the bailiff could reach him, the man in scrubs retreated through the heavy doors, leaving behind only a confused murmur among the spectators. Judge Maxwell's jaw tightened as he redirected his attention, and growing irritation, back to Dr. Washington. The disruption had only heightened his determination to maintain authority over his courtroom. Now then, he continued, his voice carrying an extra edge of sternness, let's proceed with the matter at hand. His fingers drummed against the bench in a slow, deliberate rhythm that regular attendees of his court knew all too well. It was a warning sign, like thunder before a storm. Dr. Washington stood perfectly still, her expression unchanged despite the mounting tension. She had spent countless hours in high-pressure situations in the operating room, and her professional composure didn't desert her now. But there was something in her eyes, not fear or anger, but a quiet certainty that seemed to irritate Judge Maxwell even more. Your Honor, she began again, her voice steady. I understand the seriousness of entering the hospital through the emergency exit, but there was a critical situation that required my immediate. Ms. Washington, Judge Maxwell interrupted, emphasizing the Ms. with subtle disdain. This court has heard every possible excuse for criminal behavior. Your educational background and professional attire don't exempt you from following the law. He shuffled through the papers before him, though he had already memorized the details. The security footage shows you deliberately bypassing normal entrance procedures. When confronted, you refuse to leave. Mark Bennett rose once more, his leather briefcase creaking as he leaned forward. Your Honor, if you would just allow us to present evidence of the emergency situation that necessitated. Mr. Bennett, Judge Maxwell's voice cut through the air like a knife. Your client was caught on camera breaking into a hospital. The motivation, however noble you might try to paint it, doesn't change the facts. This court has seen far too many defendants try to justify their actions with claims of necessity. The gallery had grown so quiet that the sound of the old wall clock ticking seemed to echo through the room. A law student in the back row scribbled furiously in her notebook, while a veteran court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype, anticipating the judge's next words. Judge Maxwell leaned forward, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the late afternoon light. This court takes institutional security very seriously, particularly in medical facilities. The potential for theft of drugs, confidential medical records, or equipment cannot be overlooked. The fact that you, Ms. Washington, believe your position or education places you above such concerns is precisely why this court must send a clear message. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Dr. Washington's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing the familiar preamble to one of Maxwell's infamous harsh sentences. The judge had already made up his mind. That much was clear from the set of his jaw, and the cold calculation in his eyes. But just as Judge Maxwell opened his mouth to pronounce his sentence, the courtroom doors flew open once again. This time, the man in scrubs wasn't alone. Behind him stood the hospital's chief of surgery, Dr. James Morrison, still wearing his operating theater cap. The look on his face suggested that whatever was about to happen would shake the very foundations of Judge Maxwell's carefully constructed authority. Dr. James Morrison strode into the courtroom with the same purposeful urgency he brought to emergency surgeries. His surgical cap was slightly askew, and his face bore the red marks left by hours of wearing the surgical mask. Behind him, the man in scrubs, Dr. Peter Chen, his resident, clutched an array of documents and a tablet showing security footage from the night in question. Your Honor, Dr. Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone used to making life or death decisions. I apologize for the interruption, but this matter cannot wait. He moved past the gallery's wooden barrier despite the bailiff's warning step forward. Judge Maxwell's face darkened with each unauthorized footstep. This is completely irregular, Maxwell thundered, his gavel hovering threateningly. I will have you both held in contempt if you don't remove yourselves from my courtroom immediately. The veins in his neck became visible as his complexion reddened with anger. Dr. Morrison stood his ground, his surgical shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. Your Honor, I'm Dr. James Morrison, Chief of Surgery at Grady Memorial Hospital. What you're about to do here isn't just a mistake. It's a travesty that could cost lives. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. Judge Maxwell slammed his gavel down repeatedly, but the echo of each strike only added to the growing chaos. Dr. Washington remained perfectly still, though a slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I have evidence here," Dr. Morrison continued, gesturing to the documents Dr. Chen held, "that will completely change your understanding of the events that night. Dr. Sarah Washington is not just any doctor, she's our. I don't care if she's the Surgeon General." Judge Maxwell's voice cracked with fury. "This is my courtroom, and you are interrupting a legal proceeding. Bailiff, remove these men." But Dr. Chen had already rushed forward, placing the tablet on the judge's bench. The security footage played silently, showing Dr. Washington racing through the hospital corridors, her white coat flying behind her as she headed toward the operating theaters. The timestamp read 2:43 a.m. "Your Honor," Dr. Morrison pressed on, even as the bailiff approached. "That night, we had a 7-year-old patient with a ruptured brain aneurysm. The child had minutes, maybe seconds. Dr. Washington's keycard malfunctioned, but she knew every second counted. She chose saving a life over following protocol." The courtroom had fallen into a stunned silence. Even the bailiff paused, his hand hovering uncertainly near Dr. Morrison's shoulder. Judge Maxwell stared at the tablet screen, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. "And this child," Dr. Morrison's voice softened slightly, building to the revelation that would shatter the afternoon's proceedings. "This child who needed immediate surgery. Well, Your Honor, I believe you know her quite well." Judge Maxwell's head snapped up, his face losing its angry flush as realization began to dawn. Dr. Chen stepped forward, opening a medical file with trembling hands. The name on the file caught the afternoon light. Emily Maxwell. The gavel slipped from Judge Maxwell's fingers, landing on the bench with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the now silent courtroom. His granddaughter's name on that medical file had done what no argument, no plea, no legal precedent had ever managed. It had struck him completely speechless. Dr. Washington finally moved, turning slightly to face the judge. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment, everything about their previous interaction began to shift, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. The medical file lay open on Judge Maxwell's bench, his granddaughter's name staring up at him like an accusation. His hands, usually so steady in their authority, trembled slightly as he reached for his reading glasses. The courtroom remained deathly quiet, watching as he read through the emergency report from that fateful night. Time of arrival: 2:35 a.m. BP 170-110. Patient: Emily Maxwell, age 7. Diagnosis: ruptured cerebral aneurysm. Attending physician: Dr. Sarah Washington. The words swam before his eyes as memories of that night flooded back. The frantic phone call from his son at 2 a.m., his wife's muffled sobs in the car, the endless hours in the waiting room, praying for news about Emily. He remembered the relief that had washed over him when the nurse had finally emerged, announcing that the surgery had been successful, that his precious granddaughter would live. Dr. Morrison stepped closer to the bench, his voice gentler now. Dr. Washington was at home when she received the emergency call. The hospital's electronic security system had gone into night mode, and her keycard wouldn't register. She had two choices: wait for security clearance, which could take precious minutes, or find another way in. She chose Emily's life over protocol. Judge Maxwell looked up at Dr. Washington, seeing her truly for the first time. Gone was the defendant he had been ready to sentence. In her place stood the surgeon who had spent 6 grueling hours performing the microsurgery that saved Emily's life. The same Emily who had just last weekend sat on his lap, reading him stories and showing no signs of her near-death experience. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington spoke softly, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the dramatic shift in the room's dynamics. "I took an oath to save lives. That night, your granddaughter's arterial wall was deteriorating by the second. The security footage shows I tried my keycard 3 times before making the decision to use the emergency exit. I knew it would trigger alarms, but in that moment, Emily's life mattered more than any potential consequences to myself. Dr. Chen stepped forward, pulling up more security footage on the tablet. "Here, Your Honor," he pointed to the timestamp. Dr. Washington entered through the emergency exit at 2:47 a.m. By 2:52 a.m., she was scrubbed in. The surgical notes show that any delay would have been catastrophic. Emily's aneurysm fully ruptured at 3:01 a.m., 9 minutes after Dr. Washington began the procedure. The gravity of what had almost happened, both to Emily that night and to Dr. Washington today, settled over Judge Maxwell like a heavy cloak. His gavel, the symbol of his authority that he had wielded so confidently just moments before, lay forgotten on his bench. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. In the gallery, many who had come expecting to witness just another example of Judge Maxwell's notorious harsh sentencing instead found themselves watching a powerful moment of personal reckoning. "Dr. Washington." Judge Maxwell's voice cracked slightly as he removed his glasses. "I believe the court owes you an apology." He paused, struggling to maintain his judicial composure. "No, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for—" He trailed off, the weight of years of prejudiced decisions pressing down on him. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of Emily Maxwell's medical file being closed, a sound that seemed to signal the closing of one chapter in Judge Maxwell's life and the beginning of another. Judge Maxwell's hands shook as he opened the next page of Emily's medical file. The clinical language did nothing to soften the reality of how close he'd come to losing his granddaughter. The surgical notes painted a picture that made his heart constrict. Patient presented unconscious. Severe subarachnoid hemorrhage. Immediate surgical intervention required. Dr. Morrison moved closer to the bench, his voice taking on the gentle tone doctors use when explaining difficult situations to families. "Your Honor, perhaps you remember the waiting room that night. You were there with your son Robert and his wife Sarah. The nurse who kept bringing you updates. She was relaying messages directly from Dr. Washington in the operating room." The memory hit Judge Maxwell like a physical blow. He remembered clutching his wife's hand, watching the clock tick past 3 a.m., then 4 a.m., the endless coffee cups, the quiet sobs of his daughter-in-law, the way his son paced the waiting room floor until the tiles seemed to memorize his footsteps. Emily's case was particularly challenging, Dr. Washington explained, her professional demeanor softening slightly. The aneurysm was located in her posterior communicating artery, a delicate area even in adult patients. In a child's brain, the surgical margins are incredibly small. We had to work under microscopic guidance, carefully placing the clip to prevent any damage to the surrounding tissue. The gallery listened in rapt attention as Dr. Chen pulled up brain scans on his tablet, showing them to the judge. "These are from before and after the surgery, Your Honor. The bright spot here," he pointed to a glowing area, "is where the bleeding occurred. And this," he swiped to the next image, "shows the successful repair." Dr. Washington's technique was so precise that Emily retained full function, with no neurological deficits. Judge Maxwell remembered Emily's first words when she woke up 2 days after surgery. "Grandpa, my head hurts." Such simple words, but they had brought tears to his eyes because they meant she could speak, could think, could live. He'd never asked about the surgeon who saved her, had never thought to question his assumptions about who that skilled physician might be. After the surgery, Dr. Morrison continued. Dr. Washington stayed by Emily's bedside for another 4 hours, monitoring her vital signs personally. She didn't leave until she was certain the critical period had passed. That's the kind of doctor she is. The kind who breaks through an emergency exit when minutes count. The kind who puts her patients before herself. The afternoon light caught the silver hair at Dr. Washington's temples, earned through countless nights like the one she spent saving Emily. Nights spent making split-second decisions where protocol and procedure had to take a back seat to preserving life. Last weekend, Judge Maxwell spoke, his judicial facade cracking. Emily sat on my lap reading The Cat in the Hat. She remembered every word. Her mother told me she got an A on her spelling test yesterday. He looked at Dr. Washington, really seeing her now. She can do those things because of you. The courtroom remained silent as the weight of this revelation settled. Here was a man who had been prepared to punish the very person responsible for his greatest joy, his granddaughter's continued life. The irony was devastating in its completeness. Emily's file contained a final note, written in Dr. Washington's precise handwriting. Patient discharge with excellent prognosis. Follow-up scheduled for 3 months. Demonstrated remarkable resilience. A brave little girl with her whole life ahead of her. The weight of realization pressed down on Judge Maxwell like a physical force, making his judicial robes feel suddenly heavy on his shoulders. 23 years on the bench, and never had he felt so stripped of his carefully constructed authority. The courtroom seemed to swim before his eyes as decades of decisions began to replay in his mind, each one now tainted with the possibility of bias he'd always denied. Dr. Washington remained standing, her dignity intact despite the morning's ordeal. The same hands he had nearly ordered handcuffed were the ones that had delicately navigated the blood vessels in Emily's brain. The same voice he had repeatedly interrupted had been the one giving quiet, confident instructions in the operating room that night. "I've been on this bench for nearly a quarter century," Judge Maxwell spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The microphone caught his words anyway, carrying them through the hushed courtroom. "I've always prided myself on being firm but fair. Justice is blind. I've said it 1,000 times." He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "But I wasn't blind, was I? I was seeing exactly what I wanted to see." The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting prison bar shadows across his bench. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. How many times had he sat in this very spot, looking down at defendants who looked like Dr. Washington, automatically assuming the worst? How many lives had his prejudice affected? Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, aware they were witnessing something rarely seen in these marble halls, a powerful man confronting his own fallibility. The gallery remained silent, the usual shuffling and whispers completely stilled. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington spoke, her voice carrying the same calm authority she likely used in the operating room. "I made a choice that night. I chose to break a rule to save a life. I would make the same choice again, regardless of the consequences to myself. That's not a defense. It's simply the truth." Judge Maxwell's hands trembled as he picked up Emily's medical file again. The formal medical language blurred before his eyes, but one phrase stood out. Patient's survival credited to immediate surgical intervention. If Dr. Washington had waited for security clearance, if she had followed proper protocol, if she had taken even 10 more minutes to reach the operating room. The thought was unbearable. His granddaughter's life had hung in the balance, and this woman, this surgeon he had been ready to sentence without a fair hearing, had chosen to risk her career to save her. The irony was almost too perfect in its cruelty. The law, he found himself saying, is supposed to be about justice. But justice without wisdom, without understanding, without... He paused, struggling with the words, without examining our own prejudices. That's not justice at all. The silence in the courtroom deepened as the impact of his words sank in. Several of the regular court observers exchanged glances. They had never heard Judge Maxwell speak like this. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype, capturing every word of this unprecedented moment. Dr. Washington's attorney had remained quiet, sensing that something more important than legal arguments was unfolding. His client stood straight-backed, her expression compassionate but unwavering. She had faced bias before, had surely overcome it countless times to reach her position. But today, something different was happening. She was watching it crumble in real time. Case dismissed. The words fell from Judge Maxwell's lips with a weight that suggested far more than a simple legal pronouncement. He set aside his gavel, an instrument he had wielded so confidently just hours before, and did something unprecedented in his decades on the bench. He stood up. "But before you leave, Dr. Washington," he continued, his voice carrying a tremor that silenced even the whispers in the gallery. "I need to address not just today's proceedings, but a pattern that has haunted this courtroom for far too long." The afternoon light had softened, casting a golden glow through the high windows. Dr. Washington remained at the defendant's table, her expression a mixture of professional composure and genuine curiosity. Dr. Morrison and Dr. Chen had taken seats in the front row, witnesses to a moment they hadn't anticipated when they'd burst into the courtroom. "For 23 years, Judge Maxwell began, his hands gripping the bench for support. "I've sentenced defendants from this very spot. I've always claimed to see only the facts, the evidence, the letter of the law." He paused, swallowing hard. "But today, I was forced to see something else. My own reflection." The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype, capturing every word. Law students in the gallery had abandoned their notebooks, transfixed by the unfolding scene. Even the bailiff stood motionless, his usual stoic expression softened by the raw honesty of the moment. "I looked at you, Dr. Washington, and saw what I wanted to see, what years of unchecked bias had trained me to see. I didn't see a brilliant surgeon. I didn't see someone who would risk her own freedom to save a child's life. I didn't see," his voice cracked slightly, "the person who saved my granddaughter." Dr. Washington's attorney placed a gentle hand on her arm, but she remained standing, her presence a silent testimony to every professional who had faced similar prejudices and persevered. "The true crime here," Judge Maxwell continued, "wasn't committed by you, Dr. Washington. It was committed by me, and perhaps by a system that has allowed such biases to persist unchallenged. How many others have stood where you're standing, facing not just the law, but prejudices masked as justice?" He removed his glasses, setting them carefully on the bench. "I'm ordering a review of my past cases, particularly those involving sentencing disparities. I'll be recusing myself from the bench until this review is complete." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Such a public admission of bias from a sitting judge was virtually unheard of. Additionally, he squared his shoulders, facing Dr. Washington directly. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt I can never repay. But perhaps I can begin to honor it by ensuring that no other defendant faces the kind of prejudice you encountered in my courtroom today." The silence that followed was profound. In the gallery, several observers wiped tears from their eyes. The court clerk had stopped shuffling papers, the bailiff had forgotten his usual stern demeanor, and the afternoon sun seemed to pause in its descent, as if marking the moment. "Court is adjourned," Judge Maxwell pronounced, but he remained standing. As Dr. Washington gathered her belongings, their eyes met across the courtroom. In that moment, something passed between them. An acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest acts of healing happen far from operating rooms. 6 months later, the marble halls of Atlanta Municipal Court still echoed with whispers about that remarkable afternoon. But now, those whispers carried stories of transformation rather than prejudice. Judge Maxwell's public reckoning had sparked a movement within the Georgia judicial system that few could have predicted. The review of his past cases had revealed stark patterns of bias, disparities in sentencing that couldn't be explained by any factor other than race. Rather than hide from these findings, Maxwell had done something unprecedented. He'd published them, along with a detailed public statement acknowledging his own role in perpetuating systemic inequality. On this particular morning, Maxwell sat in the back row of Courtroom 4B, now retired from the bench but present as an observer for a judicial training session he'd helped design. The topic: recognizing and addressing unconscious bias in legal proceedings. At the podium stood Dr. Sarah Washington, her surgical precision now applied to dissecting the subtle ways prejudice could infect decision-making. "Bias doesn't announce itself," she explained to the assembled judges, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had that fateful day. "It disguises itself as intuition, as experience, as gut feelings. But in medicine, as in law, we must base our decisions on evidence, not assumptions. In the months since her case, Dr. Washington had continued her work at Grady Memorial, saving countless lives with the same dedication that had driven her to break through that emergency exit. But she'd also become an unexpected catalyst for change, partnering with legal organizations to address systemic bias in the courts. Emily Maxwell, now 8 and fully recovered, had recently visited the hospital for her final follow-up appointment. She'd brought a hand-drawn card for Dr. Washington, covered in colorful hearts, and a carefully printed message. "Thank you for fixing my brain and helping my grandpa's heart." The judicial review initiative that Maxwell had started had spread to other courts in Georgia, then to neighboring states. Judges began voluntarily submitting their sentencing records for analysis, leading to uncomfortable but necessary conversations about patterns of bias that had gone unchallenged for decades. As Dr. Washington concluded her presentation, she shared one final thought. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from small moments of truth, when we're forced to confront our biases in ways we can't ignore or explain away. Maxwell watched from his seat as the judges in attendance nodded, some taking notes, others sitting in thoughtful reflection. His own notebook lay open on his lap, filled with observations and ideas. He'd discovered that unlearning bias was a continuous process, not a single moment of revelation. Later that afternoon, in the hospital cafeteria, Dr. Washington and former Judge Maxwell sat across from each other, sharing a coffee break between her surgeries and his next speaking engagement. Their unlikely friendship had become a symbol of possibility, proof that awareness could lead to action and action to change. "You know," Maxwell said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "Emily asked me something interesting yesterday. She wanted to know if she could become a doctor like you." He smiled. "She said she wants to help people's hearts and minds heal, just like her favorite surgeon." Dr. Washington's eyes softened. "Tell her the operating room will be waiting for her, and so will a world that's hopefully a little fairer than the one we grew up in." As they parted ways, she to save more lives in the operating room, he to continue his work in judicial reform. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting no shadows, only light.